He saw an elderly woman in scrubs folding linens in the pediatric wing, hands moving with mechanical precision. He didn't see the surgical steadiness in those movements. He didn't see the legend. Security cameras never captured the moment her fingers trembled, not from age, but from the muscle memory of 100 procedures on sand-covered surgical tables in Tikrit. Muscle memory doesn't fade. It just waits. Margaret Walsh had worked at Oak Creek Memorial in Denver for 3 years, 3 months, and 17 days. She kept count the way soldiers keep count of time, not because the number mattered, but because numbers meant control. The pediatric wing smelled like antiseptic and something sweeter underneath, the smell children carried before hospitals marked them. She folded fitted sheets with the precision of someone who'd learned to work in chaos. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like machinery that never rested. They matched her rhythm. Nothing else did. Her hands were the only part of her that couldn't hide. Surgical scars ran across her knuckles in thin white lines. One of the young respiratory therapists, Casey, had asked about them once. Training accident, Margaret had said, which was technically true if you counted combat triage training in a forward operating base as an accident. Casey hadn't pushed further. People in hospitals learned quickly not to push. The pair of combat boots in her locker was the other thing that couldn't hide. She touched them each shift, just once, her fingertips brushing the worn leather like a talisman. 23 years she'd worn those boots. 23 years of missions that had names she couldn't say and locations on maps she wasn't supposed to see. Then 12 years of walking away from that life, folding linens instead of packing trauma kits, existing instead of operating. The boots stayed laced, even though she hadn't worn them in a decade. The morning of General William Cross's arrival started like every other morning. Margaret pushed a cart of fresh linens down the corridor, her movements efficient and invisible. The slight limp in her left leg, a gift from a 2003 IED outside Fallujah, didn't slow her down. Pain was information. Information was power. She'd learned that when she could still move between life and death with her hands. Now she moved between rooms, folding, stacking, existing in the margins of other people's emergencies. An ambulance siren wailed somewhere outside. Margaret's shoulders didn't tense. That was a trick no one taught you. You learned it when the alternative was giving yourself away. The siren climbed and then cut to nothing. She continued folding. A younger nurse, Deepa, passed her in the hallway and didn't make eye contact. None of them did, really. Margaret had learned long ago that invisibility was easier than explanation. The elevator doors at the far end of the pediatric wing opened at 8:33 a.m. Margaret heard the movement before she saw it, wheels on tile, the specific cadence of orderlies moving a wheelchair with practiced care. She didn't look up from the linens in her hands. She was getting good at not looking. She was getting good at a lot of things that involved disappearing into background. But something in the weight of the footsteps made her pause. These weren't orderly feet. These were command feet. Boots that knew how to move through space with authority. Margaret's hand stilled for exactly 1 second, half a second longer than a civilian would notice, exactly the length a trained operative would recognize. She forced herself to continue folding. Muscle memory again. Always muscle memory. A child's voice, thin and young, said something inaudible. Then a man's voice responded. Deep. Even. The voice of someone used to making decisions that mattered. Margaret's hands kept moving. Fold. Stack. Align. Her breathing stayed level. She didn't turn to look as General William Cross walked past, his dress uniform a navy blur in her peripheral vision, every medal and insignia catching the fluorescent lights. The general's 12-year-old son sat in a wheelchair behind him, the boy's legs still and pale beneath hospital-issue blankets. A training accident, she heard someone whisper. Paralyzed from the waist down. The boy's face was the color of old snow. Dr. Hargrove appeared like he'd been summoned by the presence of rank. Hargrove always appeared when power arrived. He moved with the ease of a man who'd never had to question his authority, his white coat pristine, his handshake practiced and firm. Margaret watched the interaction from her position at the linen cart, her eyes down but her attention absolute. She'd been trained to read situations like this: threat assessment, power dynamics, the precise angle of a man's spine when he was about to make decisions that affected lives. "General Cross, it's an honor," Hargrove said. "We'll take excellent care of Danny here. The very best. Oak Creek has handled thousands of pediatric trauma cases." The general nodded. His jaw was tight. A parent watching his child in a wheelchair has a specific look. Margaret had seen it before, not in hospitals, but in military transport helicopters over Helmand Province, fathers carrying sons who'd stepped on mines. That look didn't change whether you wore dress uniforms or desert camouflage. Danny's breathing sounded shallow. Margaret noticed because she'd trained herself to hear the things other people missed. The boy's chest wasn't moving with the right rhythm. The oxygen saturation sitting above his bed probably showed 94%, which hospitals called acceptable. Margaret had learned in Tikrit that acceptable and alive weren't always the same thing. "We've got him in pediatric ICU, top floor," Hargrove continued, gesturing toward the elevators. "My team will run a full diagnostic. Imaging, neurology, the works. We'll have answers for you by this evening." Margaret folded another sheet. Her hands were steady. They were always steady when it mattered. She didn't see Hargrove glance back at the pediatric ward as he escorted the general and Danny toward the elevators. She didn't see the moment his expression shifted from deferential to dismissive. But she felt it. There was a specific temperature change in the air when authority decided it was in complete control. She'd felt it in command tents and operating theaters and in the seconds before bad decisions got people killed. The afternoon came soft and ordinary. Margaret moved through the ward checking on patients, the 7-year-old with pneumonia in room for 12, the infant with failure to thrive in the observation bay, the adolescent recovering from appendectomy in 418. She changed linens, checked vitals, documented everything with the precision of someone who'd learned that details were the difference between survival and body bags. No one paid her attention. That was the point. By 3 o'clock, Danny Cross's oxygen levels had dropped to 88%. Margaret was in the medication room, restocking supplies, when she heard the change in Case's voice over the intercom. Not panic yet. Just the slight pitch elevation that meant a nurse was aware something wasn't matching the chart. Danny's breathing had shifted. The shallow pattern. Margaret had noticed that morning had gotten worse, his small chest working harder with each breath. She moved to the ICU without being asked. That was the thing about invisible people, they could move around hospitals without accounting for themselves. She positioned herself at the edge of Danny's room, where she could see the monitors and the boy's face and the precise angle of his chest. The oxygen saturation had dropped to 85. Falling. The curve on the screen was moving in the wrong direction. Hargrove was in consultation with the neurologist 3 rooms over. He'd been running tests all day, documenting nerve damage, measuring paralysis, making it official. Important work. The kind of work that impressed generals. Margaret watched the monitors for 4 minutes. 83. 81. 79. Each number was its own small emergency. She stepped into the room, her voice level and low. "Turn him onto his side. Now." Casey looked up from the 4 pump. "What?" "Aspirated fluid in the airway. Turn him. On his side. I should get Dr. Hargrove. He'll be dead by the time Hargrove finishes his consultation. Turn him." There was something in Margaret's voice that cut through protocol. Something that made Casey move despite the hierarchy, despite the fact that she was taking orders from a floor nurse instead of the chain of command. She turned Danny carefully, and there was a wet sound, the specific sound of blockage clearing, fluid draining, a pathway opening. The monitor climbed. 82. 84. 86. Margaret's hands had been on Danny's shoulder, steadying him. Surgical hands. Hands that had done this before in conditions 10,000 times worse, in darkness with artillery overhead and sand blowing sideways and soldiers bleeding out faster than fluid could replace them. Her fingers knew exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly where to position a child for drainage, exactly how long to wait before adjusting. The oxygen climbed higher. 88. 90. 92. Footsteps came down the hallway. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his face arranged in careful authority. He took in the scene, the patient repositioned, the monitors climbing, Casey looking uncertain, and Margaret standing beside the bed with her hands still steady. "What's happening here?" Hargrove's voice was quiet. That was worse than shouting. "Danny aspirated fluid," Margaret said. "Obstructed his airway. It's clearing now." Hargrove stepped into the room. His presence changed the air like a temperature drop. "I don't recall asking for repositioning." "Casey, did I give that order?" "No, but—" "Then who authorized this intervention?" Hargrove's eyes moved to Margaret. His expression crystallized into something worse than anger. Contempt. Just a floor nurse playing doctor. "Is that what we have here?" The room went very quiet. The monitors continued their steady beeping, indifferent to hierarchy. Danny's oxygen sat at 94%, climbing toward normal. That was the only truth that mattered. But truths didn't matter when they came from the wrong mouth. Hargrove turned to General Cross, who'd appeared in the doorway behind him. The general's uniform caught the light. His face was unreadable. His son's oxygen was climbing. "I apologize for the confusion, General." Sometimes well-meaning staff exceed their scope of practice. "It won't happen again." Hargrove's voice carried an apology. It also carried a promise. Nurses fold linens and take vital signs. Doctors make clinical decisions. Let's remember that distinction. Margaret stood in the space between the general and his son. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. She didn't give Hargrove the satisfaction of reaction. Her face showed nothing. Her hands, still visible at her sides, didn't tremble. Casey looked at her shoes. General Cross looked at his son's monitor, which read 96% oxygen saturation. Then he looked at Margaret's face, which showed nothing. Then he looked at Hargrove, whose smile had turned sharp. "Of course, Doctor," the general said finally. "Understood." Hargrove nodded, satisfied. He'd established hierarchy. He'd reminded everyone of their place. He'd done it in front of a 4-star general, which meant he'd made it official. Margaret Walsh was a floor nurse. Not a decision-maker. Not someone whose assessment mattered. Not someone worth listening to, even when she was right. She left the room 2 minutes later when she was certain Danny's airway was stable and his oxygen wasn't falling. She walked down the pediatric corridor, past the nurse's station where her presence would be noted and filed away, past the medication room where she kept the boots she'd stopped wearing a decade ago. She pushed the linen cart into the supply closet and closed the door. The darkness in there was complete. No monitors. No fluorescent lights. No one watching. No one listening. Margaret took one measured breath. She held it for 4 seconds. She released it slowly, the way she'd learned in a desert where controlled breathing meant controlled outcomes. She closed her eyes. Then she reached up with the back of her hand and wiped a single tear from her cheekbone. Just one. Just enough to prove she was human. Just enough to release the pressure that had built in her chest when she realized that even being right, even when it mattered, even when a child's life depended on it, being right meant nothing when you were invisible. When you were just a floor nurse. When nobody knew who you'd been, what you'd done, or what kind of hands you were moving beneath those scrubs. She opened her eyes. The closet stayed dark. But her hands, when she pressed her palms against the cart, were completely steady. By afternoon, Dr. Hargrove's memo had circulated through every department at Oak Creek Memorial. It came through email first, a carefully worded message to all attending physicians, department heads, and the Hospital Administration Council. The subject line read, "Clinical judgment and scope of practice concerns." Margaret's name appeared only once, buried in the third paragraph, but the message was unmistakable. She could see it in the way nurses glanced at her when she passed the medication station. The way conversation stopped when she entered the supply room. The silence wasn't accusation yet. It was preparation. She didn't read the memo herself until 3:02 p.m., posted on the unit bulletin board beside the break room. Her fingers traced the typed words, dangerous overreach, pattern of clinical overestimation, questions regarding appropriate scope of practice for non-physician personnel. Hargrove had been precise. He hadn't called her incompetent. He'd made her sound ambitious in exactly the wrong way. Ambitious nurses were dangerous. Ambitious nurses crossed lines. Ambitious nurses got people hurt. The formal write-up appeared an hour later on the physical board, a laminated sheet with her name printed in bold capitals. Scope of practice violation, M. Walsh. It was dated that morning, backdated to make it seem routine, something documented long before today's drama in Danny Cross's room. The charges were technical, unsolicited clinical assessment beyond nursing scope, unauthorized recommendations to attending physician, potential risk to patient safety due to presumptive diagnostic intervention. Reading it, Margaret understood what Hargrove had done. He'd taken her competence and reframed it as insubordination. He'd made her rightness into a liability. 3 nurses stood reading the board when she approached. They scattered like startled birds, one of them actually knocking her coffee cup against the rim. No one apologized. No one made eye contact. Margaret stood alone at the board, her shadow falling across the laminated warning, and she understood that isolation had officially begun. The break room at 4:15 p.m. held 5 nurses, Delia from night shift, Marcus from post-op, 3 float staff she recognized by sight. Margaret pushed open the door with her lunch tray, turkey sandwich, an apple, black coffee. The room didn't immediately empty. They waited perhaps 3 seconds, long enough that it felt intentional, long enough that it felt like a choice. Delia stood first, gathering her purse with deliberate slowness. Marcus followed, then the floats, all of them moving toward the exit in silence. None of them looked at her. None of them spoke. The coffee cup clinked against the trash can. The door side closed. Margaret sat at the table nearest the window. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound like electrical insects, and she opened her sandwich without tasting it. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She was alone in the break room, and the absence of other people felt like the absence of oxygen, but her body didn't betray her. Years of military training had taught her something essential: composure under isolation was just another form of survival. She ate the sandwich. She drank the coffee. She sat in the fluorescent brightness as if she belonged there. What they didn't know was that Dr. Hargrove had already contacted 2 members of the hospital board, including his medical school roommate from Johns Hopkins, the one who'd become the hospital's financial director. He'd also placed calls to independent investigators, consultants he retained personally, paid from discretionary funds that didn't require transparency. The narrative was already hardening: floor nurse with delusions of medical expertise, pattern of boundary violations, potential liability issue. One phone call from Hargrove's office had requested her personnel file from her previous employer, a community hospital in Albuquerque where she'd worked before coming to Oak Creek. The file was sealed, confidential, but Hargrove's inquiry carried the weight of institutional authority. People responded to that weight. At 4:42 p.m., Margaret stood at the medication station entering vitals for her assigned patients. She'd been reassigned that morning, moved off the pediatric wing without explanation. The change had come through the charge nurse, a verbal note, not a formal document, just a new assignment sheet posted without her input. She was now responsible for orthopedic post-op patients, for rooms down the south corridor, as far from pediatrics as the hospital layout allowed. As far from Danny Cross as Hargrove could push her. She moved through her new patients with automatic precision, checking surgical drains, monitoring post-operative pain levels, documenting fluid intake and output. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, while her mind remained fractured between two places. In the pediatric wing, she could see Danny's room from the hallway, the small figure in the hospital bed, the general sitting in the corner chair, the window overlooking Denver's eastern skyline. And here, in orthopedic care, she was far enough away that she could tell herself it wasn't her problem anymore. That was what Hargrove had accomplished. He hadn't just humiliated her in front of the general. He'd removed her entirely from the situation. He'd made her absence official. At 5:03 p.m., Corporal James Evans was rotating through the emergency department as part of his field medic certification program. He'd served 3 tours with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, as a combat medic before medical school, and this rotation was supposed to be routine, observation, assisting with triage, learning hospital protocol. He was assisting with a motor vehicle accident victim when Margaret came through the ER doors pushing a stretcher. Not her usual assignment. She was orthopedic now, but traumas came to the entire hospital sometimes, and Margaret had been redirected to assist. The patient was a 43-year-old male with a pneumothorax, collapsed lung, hypoxic, shallow breathing that sounded like someone learning to breathe for the first time. The attending ER doctor was efficient but not exceptional. He called for a chest tube kit, began assembling the equipment, and was prepping the insertion site when Margaret appeared at the patient's bedside. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce herself. She simply moved, her body becoming an extension of some larger purpose, and Evans watched as she took the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the tray with fingers that had clearly done this before. Many times before. The insertion technique was flawless. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the precise anatomical landmark taught only to advanced combat medics in forward operating bases across Tikrit and Fallujah and Kandahar. Her needle found the intercostal space with a confidence that spoke of hands that had done this while explosions occurred, while IEDs blew apart hums, while the sound of rotor blades meant incoming casualties. The hiss of air escaping told the story before the monitors could, lung re-expanding, oxygen saturation climbing from 68% to 75 to 84 to 91. The patient gasped and breathed and gasped, and Margaret secured the tube with movements that were economical and certain. Evans froze. His medical school training recognized clinical excellence. His military service recognized something else entirely, the unmistakable hand signature of someone who'd run triage in a combat zone. You didn't learn that technique in a civilian hospital. You learned it when survival measured itself in seconds and blood was information and pain was data. She worked like someone who'd held more lives in her hands than most trauma surgeons saw in a decade. After the patient was stabilized, after the monitoring equipment confirmed chest tube placement and proper ventilation, Margaret was turning away from the bedside when Evans followed her. His voice was careful, respectful. "Where did you train? That technique, that's not standard civilian protocol." Margaret stopped. She turned. Her eyes met his, and there was something in that gaze that made Evans understand instantly that he was asking a question he wasn't supposed to ask. She didn't speak. She simply gave a slow shake of her head, a warning clear as any verbal order. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing down the corridor before Evans could ask anything else. That evening, in her car in the hospital parking garage, Margaret's hands began to shake. The shaking came from somewhere deep, from a place she'd been trying to medicate with quiet shifts and routine and the fiction that she could hide from what she'd seen. Combat triage in Tikrit. The faces. The 17 Marines she'd saved during Operation Ironside, the ones whose names appeared on her DD 214, the ones whose faces still visited her at 3 a.m. She gripped the steering wheel and couldn't insert the key. Couldn't turn the ignition. Couldn't move, because moving meant acknowledging that nothing stayed buried. Nothing stayed hidden. Her pager buzzed at 6:18 p.m. ICU admission. Patient, Danny Cross. Diagnosis, acute respiratory distress, possible cardiac complications. Transfer from pediatric ward. Code yellow. The message scrolled across the screen of the device clipped to her scrubs, and Margaret read it twice, understanding in that moment that her absence had changed nothing. Hargrove had removed her from the case, had isolated her, had dismantled her credibility, and still, the boy was failing. Still, despite the General's authority and Hargrove's arrogance and the institutional power arranged against her, Danny's body was betraying him exactly as she'd predicted. She started the car. The engine turned over, smooth and inevitable as consequence. The engine turned over, smooth and inevitable as consequence. Margaret sat in her Subaru in the Oak Creek Memorial parking lot, hands at 10 and 2, watching the emergency bay doors slide open and close like a mouth swallowing the night. 2:17 a.m. The graveyard shift hummed somewhere inside the building, and she was not part of it anymore. Hargrove's memo had been precise. Orthopedic flaw, effective immediately. No pediatric rotation. No ICU access. Her badge would no longer open certain doors. The security system would log every attempt, every corridor, every moment of her defiance catalogued and filed. He wasn't just removing her from Danny's case. He was building a paper trail of her violations, layer by layer, each restricted access another proof of her inability to respect hierarchy, another brick in the wall he was constructing to bury her completely. She'd spent 18 years in combat zones where rules meant survival. Where a medic who followed protocol instead of reading the patient often buried a soldier instead of saving one. But this was different. This was a hospital. This was peacetime. This was a place where the hierarchy mattered more than the child. The parking lot was empty except for 3 vehicles. Her car. A silver Mercedes, Hargrove's. A GMC truck with a handicap placard hanging from the mirror. General Cross, still inside, still waiting, still hoping his son would get better because that's what fathers do when they can't fix something with rank or authority or will. They wait. They pray. They become powerless in the way only a 4-star general can understand. Margaret's scrubs were still damp with antiseptic. She'd cleaned the orthopedic floor for 7 hours after the memo arrived, mopping, restocking, existing in the margins of a unit where nobody needed her expertise and nobody wanted her presence. The irony was sharp as a scalpel. She was finally practicing exactly what Hargrove demanded. She was just a nurse. She was staying in her lane. But she couldn't stop thinking about Danny's respirations. Over the past 36 hours, she'd caught glimpses of him through corridor windows and open doors, always from a distance, always as a spectator rather than a provider. The boy had been stable the first afternoon after Hargrove's reassignment. Sitting up, talking to his father, the wheelchair parked beside the bed like a promise that recovery was still possible. But yesterday morning, something had shifted. His breathing had become shallower. Margaret had noticed it because she couldn't help but notice. The same way a combat medic couldn't help but notice the smell of ketones in breath or the pallor that preceded septic shock. Danny's chest rise had decreased. The rhythm had become more rapid, more labored. When General Cross stepped out to take a call in the hallway, Margaret had paused with her mop bucket outside the room and watched the boy's shoulders work harder than they should have had to work. His heart rate on the monitor, visible through the window, was sitting at 118. For a recovering 12-year-old at rest, that was wrong. She'd written it down. Orthopedic floor assignment, 1423. Patient observed via external window. RR increased to 26. HR 118. Shallow breathing pattern noted. Had not reported because she had no authority to report. Not anymore. The second afternoon was worse. Danny's lips had taken on a faint dusky tone around the edges. Not dramatic enough for an alarm, not obvious enough to trigger a code. But there a subtle shift in the oxygen saturation at the cellular level. The kind of change that a trained eye caught and an exhausted resident missed. Margaret had been restocking linens on the pediatric floor, technically still on payroll, technically still in the hospital, technically allowed to walk past the ICU on her way to supply closet rotation. She'd noted the time. 15:06, Danny's oxygen sat reading 94% on room air. For a boy without primary lung pathology, that was declining. No one else seemed to notice. The nurses charting at the station didn't look concerned. The resident doing rounds moved quickly, checking boxes, moving on. Hargrove had made morning rounds at 6:30, spent for minutes with Danny, and never returned. That's what power looked like when it was exercised as absence. He'd already won. He'd already removed her. Her input wasn't needed. Her observations weren't wanted. Margaret drove home and sat in her kitchen with cold coffee and the rain hammering against the window like an interrogation. She thought about Tikrit. She thought about the difference between watching a patient deteriorate because you weren't allowed to help and watching a patient deteriorate because you weren't there. She thought about the 17 men she'd saved in a forward operating base with no blood bank, no CT scanner, no ventilators, just her hands and her judgment and the absolute freedom to act. She thought about the 3 she couldn't save, whose names she still spoke in the dark, whose families still didn't know why their sons came home in boxes. She thought about her husband. About the promise she'd made to use her hands to help, to never let fear or protocol stop her from doing what was right. But he'd been dead for 4 years, and she'd been running from that promise ever since. At 22:06 on the second night, Margaret was mopping the pediatric floor when the code alert didn't come. That was the problem. No alarm meant no one was reading the signs. No crisis meant no one was looking closely enough to see the slow suffocation beginning. She parked her Subaru again at 23:04. Orthopedic floor staff was thin on graveyard, 2 nurses covering 18 patients, a resident somewhere doing paperwork, the attending unreachable except by phone. The ICU was 2 corridors away. Her badge would still open the elevator on the pediatric unit. Hargrove had reassigned her from Danny's case, but he hadn't revoked her general hospital access. He was too arrogant for that. Revoking would admit he was threatened. Restricting her role was sufficient punishment. It was strategic. It was what a competent antagonist did. He didn't overplay his hand. He controlled the board and assumed the pieces would obey. Margaret had learned long ago that the most dangerous assumption was the assumption that someone wouldn't act. She moved through the hallway with the particular invisibility of the night shift nurse, the one who belonged nowhere and therefore belonged everywhere. A shadow in scrubs, carrying a flashlight, doing the work no one wanted to watch. She pushed through the ICU doors at 23:16 and the machines sang their mechanical lullaby. The hiss of ventilators. The rhythmic beep of cardiac monitors. The soft pneumatic hiss of automatic blood pressure cuffs cycling every 15 minutes. The sound of everything working exactly as designed, keeping dying people alive until someone decided what to do about them. Danny's room was 3 beds down. General Cross sat in a chair beside his son's bed, eyes closed, jaw slack with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from watching your child suffer while remaining completely powerless. The boy was asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a pattern Margaret recognized with the kind of precision that combat had taught her. She'd learned to read breathing the way musicians read sheet music, every pause, every acceleration, every subtle irregularity and note in a composition that meant something. Danny's breathing was the composition of a child in cardiac tamponade. His lips were dusky gray. His oxygen saturation on the monitor read 87% despite the nasal cannula delivering 4 liters per minute. His heart rate was 134. His blood pressure, visible on the oscillometric display, was 82/51. The numbers were a story Margaret had learned to read in the worst places on Earth. Fluid was compressing his heart. The injury from the training accident, some kind of impact that had felt minor enough to go unnoticed, had created a small bleed. Just a small one. Just enough. Over 36 hours, it had accumulated in the pericardial sac. Each beat of his heart was pushing against water, metaphorically drowning while his lungs remained dry. Muffled heart sounds. That was the classic finding. Margaret moved to the bedside, her movements careful and deliberate, and leaned close enough to listen. General Cross's eyes opened, but he didn't speak. Fathers learned quickly that speaking to nurses meant breaking whatever concentration that nurse had. He watched her. Waited. Margaret heard it. The sound of his heart was distant. Underwater. Like listening to a drummer playing inside a swimming pool. The heart sounds were muffled because they were traveling through fluid instead of tissue. That was the problem. That was what no one else had noticed. She stepped back and looked at the monitor. The waveform was there. The electrical activity of his heart was intact. It was just a mechanical problem now. Fluid. Pressure. Simple physics. The solution was equally simple and absolutely forbidden. She reached for the phone at the bedside station. Paged Hargrove stat. The message went out at 23:31. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh did not exist anymore, but a pediatric floor nurse named Margaret did. And she was requesting the attending physician's immediate presence for a deteriorating pediatric patient. Protocol. Respect. Following the chain of command exactly as she'd been ordered to do. No response. She waited 90 seconds. Paged again at 23:32. Stat. ICU. Danny Cross. Room for 12. Attending response requested immediately. The night resident, a first-year named Chen, arrived instead of Hargrove. He looked at the monitors with the panic of someone who'd only memorized diseases and not yet learned how to read the living. His oxygen is dropping, Chen said, voice climbing toward the frequency of a man about to lose control. We need to increase his oxygen. We need to call respiratory. We need. Call your attending, Margaret said. Her voice had changed. She didn't notice this happening, but it was happening, dropping half an octave, shedding the deference of the past 3 years like a snake shedding old skin. Now. Chen reached for the phone. Margaret reached for the pericardiocentesis kit from the crash cart. It was sitting 3 feet away, waiting in its red container with the plastic packaging and the 18-gauge needle inside. She pulled the kit and moved to the bedside with the kind of purposeful calm that exists only in people who've done this before. Who've done this in the dark? Who've done this while screaming? Who've done this and saved lives? General Cross sat up. He understood hierarchy and authority. He understood command decisions. He understood that something had shifted in the room. He didn't speak. He just moved out of the way. Margaret's hands were perfectly steady. 11:47 p.m. The pediatric wing of Oak Creek Memorial hummed with the ordinary chaos of a Denver hospital on a Tuesday night, monitors beeping in steady rhythms, fluorescent lights casting that particular quality of institutional fluorescence that made everything look pale and urgent. Margaret stood at the supply cart on the 3rd floor, restocking bandage packs and 4 kits, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Her name badge caught the light. No one looked at it. No one looked at her. That was precisely how she had engineered it. The call came through the overhead intercom. Not her call. Not her unit. Just a routine update on patient status changes that every nurse could hear. Danny Cross. Elevated heart rate. Shallow breathing. Muffled heart sounds on auscultation. Margaret's hands paused over a roll of tape. Muffled heart sounds. That was the sound of fluid pressing against the cardiac chambers, the auditory signature of a heart being slowly suffocated. That was the sound of a boy running out of time. She had watched his decline from a distance for 36 hours, kept away from his case by Hargrove's calculated reassignments, denied access to his room, blocked from so much as reviewing his chart. But she had passed his doorway 3 times today. Each time, she had seen what the monitors were telling her, oxygen saturation dropping in a shallow slope, then steeper, then steeper. Central venous pressure rising. His father, General Cross, sitting in a chair that was too small for a man who commanded divisions, looking powerless in a way that probably terrified him far more than any combat zone ever had. The ICU was 2 floors up. Hargrove had taken the case. Hargrove, who had humiliated her, who had circulated memos questioning her competence, who had orchestrated her isolation with the precision of someone dismantling a rival. But Hargrove was not in the hospital right now. The on-call resident was Dr. Chen, a competent but cautious young physician in his second year, and the night nurse was Rebecca Torres, sharp and attentive but without the instinct to recognize what Margaret already knew was happening. Margaret moved like water through the corridors. Not rushed. Not panicked. Just a night shift employee moving with purpose toward a destination that made sense. By the time she reached the ICU doors, her scrubs blended her into the background. The security badge on her lanyard was enough to get her past the threshold. She had worked here long enough that no one questioned her presence anymore. Danny lay in the bed with his father beside him, General Cross's hand resting on the boy's shoulder with the gentleness of a man who had learned long ago that strength and tenderness were not opposing forces. The monitors above the bed told the entire story in beeps and digital numbers. O2 saturation 89%. Heart rate 118. The rise and fall of his chest was shallow, labored. His lips had taken on a faint blue tint at the edges, cyanosis creeping in like a tide. Dr. Chen was reviewing the latest labs, frowning at something that didn't add up. Rebecca was charting at the central station, focused on her documentation, which meant she wasn't watching the monitor trends the way she should have been. No one was watching the monitor trends. Margaret moved to Danny's bedside as if she belonged there. She had lived long enough in the space between visibility and invisibility to know exactly how to exist in both simultaneously. General Cross looked up, recognition and question crossing his face simultaneously. In that single moment, something in Margaret's presence, something in the way she moved, the way her hand reached for the monitor, the absolute certainty in her posture, silenced whatever challenge he might have mounted. She did not ask permission. She did not announce herself. She simply leaned forward and repositioned Danny's oxygen mask, tilting his head slightly, watching as his breathing immediately deepened by a marginal but measurable degree. Muscle memory. Combat field medicine. The knowledge that lay dormant in her hands, waiting for exactly this moment. Danny's lips pinked up fractionally. His oxygen saturation climbed from 89 to 91. Marginal. Not enough. Not nearly enough for what was happening inside his chest. His heart sounds, Margaret said quietly. Not to Rebecca. Not to Dr. Chen. To General Cross, who was watching her with the focused intensity of a soldier recognizing another soldier. The general understood. In the military, clarity in a crisis was its own language. Rebecca Torres emerged from the central station then, finally noticing the presence at Danny's bedside. "Can I help you?" she began, but something in Margaret's expression, not hostile, not dismissive, simply absolute, made her pause. "Get me a pericardiocentesis kit. 14-gauge needle, 1-liter saline bag, and a sterile field. Now." Margaret's voice had dropped an octave. This was not a request. This was not a suggestion. This was the voice of someone who had given these orders in conditions far worse than a Denver pediatric ICU. Rebecca moved without questioning. Whatever was in Margaret's demeanor registered at a level deeper than logic. General Cross's hand tightened slightly on his son's shoulder, but he did not step back. Margaret was already scrubbing her hands with the antiseptic foam. Sterile gloves snapped over her palms like the beginning of a ritual. The pericardiocentesis kit appeared. Rebecca had moved with the urgency that comes from recognizing true emergency when it walks into your unit wearing Florner scrubs. Dr. Chen was suddenly beside them, understanding beginning to crystallize behind his eyes. "Is this indicated?" he asked carefully. Margaret did not answer him directly. Instead, she looked at the boy and said, "This is going to feel strange. You're going to feel pressure in your chest, and then you're going to feel like you can breathe again. Your body is very smart. Trust it." She positioned the needle below Danny's xiphoid process, the bony landmark at the base of his sternum, angling it toward his left shoulder, toward the space where the fluid had accumulated like an attacker's hands around a victim's throat. This was the angle that 17 men in Tikrit had felt the benefit of. This was the muscle memory of hands that had held beating hearts in conditions where the electricity had gone out and the forward operating base was taking small arms fire, and there was nothing but hands and knowledge and the absolute refusal to let a life slip away. "Everyone breathe," Margaret said quietly. The needle advanced. She felt the change in resistance as the needle penetrated the pericardial sac, a subtle shift, like the difference between cutting water and cutting silk. A syringe connected to the needle hub. She began to withdraw. Dark fluid. Burgundy, almost black. Serosanguinous fluid that had been pressing against the boy's heart for hours, suffocating it with its weight. "I need the drainage kit," Margaret said. Rebecca was already preparing it. The syringe emptied. 50 milliliters of fluid. 80. 120. 170. With each withdrawal, the cardiac monitor showed the change, the compressed waveforms beginning to normalize, the muffled heart sounds clearing, the electrical rhythm of a heart given space to beat again. Danny gasped. His first full breath in what felt like days. Then another. His chest rose and fell with the normal rhythm of a 12-year-old boy instead of the desperate shallow gasps of someone drowning in his own body cavity. The monitors adjusted in real time. O2 saturation 94. 96, 98. Heart rate dropping from the tachycardic 118 toward something sustainable. The alarms quieted. Margaret withdrew the needle with the same precision she had advanced it. Her hands did not shake. Her voice remained level. "Direct pressure with gauze. Dressing after we confirm the bleeding has stopped. I want a chest film and repeat echo in 30 minutes. Dr. Chen was staring at her. Rebecca Torres was staring at her. General Cross was watching his son breathe, actually breathe, deeply, without struggle, and something in his military bearing shifted. He understood exactly what he had just witnessed. He understood that his son was alive because a woman in a pediatric floor nurse's uniform had recognized what everyone else in his hospital had missed. "Thank you," Danny said, his young voice small in the suddenly quiet ICU. "I can breathe now." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "You can." She was disposing of the kit, removing her gloves with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times, when Dr. Chen approached her quietly. "What's your name?" he asked. "Floor nurse," Margaret replied, and the flatness in her voice made it clear that this was all the answer she intended to give. She was turning to leave when General Cross spoke. "You're the one he called about. The one my son asked for when he couldn't breathe." It was not a question. Margaret paused. She did not turn around. "Sir, I should not have been in this unit." "That's not what I asked," the general said, and suddenly the authority in his voice was the same authority as Margaret's had been, the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed because their orders came from a place beyond politics, beyond hierarchy. Pure necessity. Pure survival. She turned to face him. For the first time, she met his eyes directly, and in that moment something passed between them, recognition. "He was dying, sir." No one else could hear it. The general nodded once. "I know exactly what that sounds like." He extended his hand. "Whatever happens next, I want you to know that you saved my son's life tonight. I won't forget that." Margaret took his hand. His grip was firm, military, respectful in the way that only soldiers truly understand respect. But that wasn't the worst part. Because at exactly 20 minutes after 2 in the morning, as Danny slept peacefully with normal vitals and a chest tube positioned safely, as General Cross sat beside his son's bed with tears on his weathered face, as Margaret stripped off her gloves and moved toward the exit with the intention of never entering this ICU again, the elevator doors opened. Dr. Hargrove stepped out in home clothes, hastily thrown on, still wrinkled from sleep, his face flushed with the look of someone who had received a phone call that jolted him from bed. His eyes swept across the ICU in that calculating way he had, the way of a predator assessing territory. His gaze landed on Danny's bed. On the drainage kit. On the dressing. On the stabilized monitor. On Margaret. His face went white. Not the white of shock, The white of absolute rage. Hargrove's face went white when Margaret stepped back from the bed. Not the white of shock. The white of absolute rage. He'd walked in expecting to find a disaster. Instead, he found the evidence of his own incompetence draining into a sterile catch basin. The fluid that should have killed Danny Cross. The fluid he'd missed. The fluid that a floor nurse, had identified and drained while he slept in his cool room, phone off, unreachable. 20 minutes. That's all it took for everything to crumble. Danny's oxygen saturation climbed to 92%. His color returned from slate gray to something resembling a living child. His father stood frozen in the corner, watching a woman in scrubs perform a miracle that the chief of surgery had deemed unnecessary. General William Cross's jaw tightened as the monitors stabilized. He'd been in combat leadership long enough to recognize competence when it moved past him like water finding its level. He'd also been military long enough to recognize what came next. Hargrove left the ICU at 2:41 a.m. and didn't return to the patient. He went directly to his office and locked the door. The phone call started at 3:44 a.m. First to the hospital board president, his medical school roommate, a man whose career Hargrove had quietly advanced through referrals and recommendations. Then to the state nursing board. Then to 2 independent investigators he personally retained, men who owed him consultation fees and had never asked him a difficult question in their lives. By 4:22 a.m., Hargrove had constructed a narrative as clean and precise as surgical sutures. The floor nurse had overstepped her scope of practice. She'd falsified her credentials. She performed an invasive procedure without authorization. The consequences could have been catastrophic. Only luck and the location of the needle insertion had prevented permanent cardiac damage. She'd put the hospital at liability. She was a danger to patients. He sent emails to every person he'd called. He attached what he claimed were discrepancies in her employment file. He copied the hospital's legal department and the risk management director. He made himself the voice of patient safety while constructing a case against the woman who'd saved his reputation. By dawn, security had orders to escort Margaret Walsh out of Oak Creek Memorial. She didn't resist. She didn't argue. She accepted the cardboard box they handed her, her belongings, 3 years of her life condensed into 24 inches of flattened paper, and walked to the parking lot in the first light of morning. The guard held the door open. The hospital she'd healed in, quietly and without recognition, closed behind her like a lock clicking shut. The rain in Denver that morning fell hard and cold, the kind of spring rain that felt like an ending rather than a beginning. Margaret drove to Fort Logan National Cemetery in South Denver, the military burial ground that stretched across 84 acres of consecrated ground. She knew exactly where to go. She'd been here before, not often enough, never often enough. The grave marker was a simple white stone. No rank displayed. No medals engraved. Just a name and 2 dates that were never close enough together. She pressed her hand against the cold marble and spoke to a man who'd been dead for 8 years. I tried to save that boy the way I couldn't save you, and they destroyed me for it. I failed us both. The rain hammered her shoulders and her hair and her face, and she stood there until her fingers went numb against the stone. The cardboard box sat in the grass beside her, getting soaked. What she didn't know was that the moment Hargrove had filed those false reports, he'd committed a federal crime. Falsifying documents against a military veteran in an attempt to obstruct justice wasn't a state matter anymore. It was NCIS jurisdiction. It was FBI. It was the kind of offense that didn't require Margaret to make a single phone call, because General William Cross had already made them. On the 4th day, the rotor wash shook every window on the east side of Oak Creek Memorial. The black SUVs rolled into the front parking lot with synchronized precision. Armed personnel in dress uniforms moved through the corridors with a kind of purposeful silence that made civilians step aside instinctively. The army doesn't announce itself. It arrives. Hargrove was in the boardroom with hospital administration, still building his case, still talking about liability and scope of practice, when the door opened and General William Cross walked through like a man entering a room he owned. The general didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table while two Navy officers flanked the doorway behind him. His uniform carried more ribbons than Hargrove had seen in 30 years of civilian practice. His presence made the air pressure change. "Where is Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh?" The general's voice was level. It was also a command. Hospital administration exchanged confused glances. The board president looked at Hargrove. Hargrove's face flushed deep crimson. "I'm not sure what you," the hospital administrator began. "General, she's no longer employed here," the board president offered carefully. The general's eyes narrowed. He nodded once to one of the officers, who spoke into his radio. 60 seconds later, a 13-year-old boy was wheeled into the boardroom by a Navy medical corpsman. Danny Cross was still in that chair, still healing, but his eyes were clear and bright and focused. The boy straightened as much as his injuries allowed. His hand rose in a salute that shook with effort. His young voice cracked with emotion as he said the words he'd been waiting to speak since Margaret walked out of the hospital with a cardboard box in her hands. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, sir." The silence in that room was the kind of silence that happens when the world tips sideways and everyone realizes they've been standing on the wrong side of a line they couldn't see. A trembling nurse, one of Hargrove's people, one of the ones who'd whispered in hallways and crossed to the other side, opened Margaret's military file with shaking hands. Her voice wavered as she read, "Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Bronze Star. Each medal its own sentence. Each recognition its own small hammer blow against Hargrove's carefully constructed lies." Then the SEAL team leader stepped forward. His dress uniform hung on him like precision itself, medals arranged in perfect rows, every crease sharp enough to cut. He'd come from Camp Lejeune for this. He'd come because Margaret Walsh had saved 17 of his men in Tikrit under fire in 2009, and that kind of debt doesn't expire. "Navy Cross," he said, his voice carrying the weight of every life she'd held in her hands in a forward operating base where the only rule was that everyone came home alive or everyone came home. "Presented for extraordinary heroism in combat. For tactical excellence. For selfless service under conditions of extreme danger." Hargrove opened his mouth. No words came. The FBI agent stepped forward then, a woman in a dark suit with the kind of face that had seen too many lies. "Dr. Richard Hargrove, you're under arrest for falsification of federal personnel records and obstruction of justice in an ongoing veterans protection matter." The cuffs came out. They went on with a sound like finality. His face went red. His jaw clenched so tight the muscles jumped. Veins stood out on his forehead as he screamed denials and accusations and explanations that no one would hear, not anymore. "This is absurd. I was protecting patients from an unqualified." General Cross's voice cut through like a blade through tissue. "That unqualified nurse saved my son's life when you were too arrogant to answer your pages." The walk to the exit took 90 seconds. Hargrove's feet shuffled. His hands behind his back. His mouth still moving. The hospital staff lined the corridors in complete silence, nurses, doctors, orderlies, the same people he'd manipulated and rewarded and threatened now watching his face twist in mid-protest as photographers' flashes illuminated every detail of his humiliation. The perp walk was captured by every local news camera waiting outside. The next morning, his mugshot would be on every screen in Denver. Immediate termination. License suspension pending state review. The outside investigators suddenly had nothing to say. The state nursing board received a call from a Navy admiral explaining exactly who Margaret Walsh was. All complaints were withdrawn. The case was closed. But Margaret didn't know any of this yet. She was still standing in the rain at Fort Logan, still pressing her hand against cold marble. It took a Navy captain 3 hours to find her? He stood at the fence line, out of uniform, giving her space until she was ready to acknowledge that the world had already changed. "Senior Chief, it's time to come home," he said. She shook her head. Rain dripped from her hair. "I can't go back to that world. Not that home. A different one." 6 months later, Margaret walked through the Denver VA hospital as its trauma coordinator. She wore her own uniform now, not scrubs, but the quiet authority of someone who'd stopped hiding. Her office overlooked the Front Range, where snow was beginning to fall in thick, steady silence. On her desk sat a pair of worn combat boots polished to mirror shine. The same boots she'd left in her locker at Oak Creek Memorial. The same boots Danny Cross had brought to her on a visit 3 months into her new life. Attached to them was a note in a child's careful handwriting: "Heroes walk quiet until they run toward fire. Thank you for saving my life. From Danny Cross." Subscribe, like, and comment below to join thousands learning about the quiet heroes walking among us, the ones we judge too quickly, the ones we underestimate until they save everything. Tell us, have you ever been wrong about someone, the way Hargrove was wrong about Margaret?